Hey there, it's Paul Clinton again with the B2B Marketing How to Stand Out podcast. And we interviewed John Wright, a sales leader at various online recruitment SaaS providers. Most recently, he was the SVP at Employ. We talked to John about a couple of really interesting topics. We covered alignment in sales and marketing in the enterprise and what that looks like. We talked about whether lead attribution is necessary and or helpful. And we also talked about the three parts of an all-bound motion for your go-to-market engine. I hope you enjoyed the interview. You've been in some interesting environments. One thing that really stuck out, on your LinkedIn profile for me was I believe you said, your last role that you had partnered with product marketing and customer success to refine value messaging and ICP. So let's just kind of start with that idea. I mean, not everybody necessarily would say that yes, we need like sales and marketing working, closely together, but many people would. But it is a worthy
Mm.
goal, right?
Yeah, I think so, right? Like I think that's the goal. And in a lot of companies you see it, manifest as you have like a CRO who oversees both, right? And trying to have some sort of alignment and cohesion between the groups. It's also difficult. I think a lot of what we've run into in my past experience is how are KPIs different for marketing versus sales, right? Like what is sales viewing as success versus marketing viewing as success? Which I
Mhm.
think, if there's misalignment there, it's incredibly tough to have, common goals and success that
Mhm.
everybody stacks hands on, right? What you end up getting is those meetings where both are pointing their fingers at each other saying, well, we sent you enough leads. Well, the leads you sent us aren't quality, right? All of that infighting that just leads to
Yeah.
a lot of problems.
Well, let's kind of start, but kind of back up a step, with kind of the business strategy piece. And I always feel like, like I said, that seems to be like the root of the problem in a lot of cases. So, obviously, it's going to come from the executive level
Mhm.
business strategy, and we all need, strong executive leaders who support this idea. But let's say we'd have that. And so I guess the first thing that when you talk about refining your ICP, I mean that's your ideal customer profile. A lot of times, sales owns that, and I kind of feel like a lot of times the marketing side of the house
Mhm.
doesn't take enough ownership on the ICP, refining the ICP. But what do you see as like marketing's role, in helping with the ICP? You always hear the phrase, like sales is closest to the customer. I don't think anybody would disagree
Yeah.
with that. But there's a way for, do you feel like the marketing side, perhaps w could sit in on sales calls or at least listen to like the gong calls or look at the
Yeah.
transcripts? What are some things that you think, ways that the marketing team can get involved in helping with the ICP?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, in a lot of terms, in a lot of ways, and thankfully at my last company where we did a lot of work on this, marketing had a big, presence there and it had a lot of a lot of opportunity to influence, direction of where we're gonna go. I think sales is kind of like the leading edge of here's what we're seeing and like what do we do with this, right? Tie all of that with RevOps being able to help kind of piece some past successes and some of the data points together. But I think from a marketing view, like the to me it's all about like ICP is one thing, but it's within that there's the silos of like, the persona within the ICP of the company that we would want to talk to, right? What are the different personas? How do we message them? What do they even care about? Sales isn't equipped, I would say, to define all of that
Yeah.
in a vacuum or on their own, right? I think they're not always keen and up to date on like best practices for certain components and marketing is, and they can leverage their expertise and even their past successes of where they're seeing, different mediums or different types of messages land well or not well with different personas. So I think there's a lot of, cohesion, a lot of work that can be done there together in that. The thing you mentioned about Gong, right? We were trying to get into that one big thing, and this may take off of kind of where you're wanting the conversation to go, but marketing has kind of always looked, at least in my experience, on how do they help further in the funnel versus just top of funnel, right? Like, how do we help with deals that are in flight or,
Hmm.
deals that are stalled, that have been
Hmm.
working for quite some time? Is there any
Hmm.
velocity you can add behind that? We were starting to get into that, right? Like Gong and tools like that are really good for,
Hmm.
kind of aggregating all of that data and giving you some results that say like these are the common places where we're getting stopped out. How do we get ahead of that? Is that marketing proactively messaging things?
Hmm.
Stuff like that I think is
Yeah.
thoughtful, but also like
Yeah.
kind of could be like the Nirvana world, right? Where it's like
Mhm.
it's the utopia of what you're trying to get to, but difficult to really land.
Yeah, yeah, and so we I don't know how you would look at it. I mean, we always hear like funnel and pipeline, and I know those are kind of sometimes used interchangeably. But
Sure.
the way I look at it is marketing's job is to kind of get people into this pipeline where we're kind of moving people along from traffic to MQL to SQL to
Hmm.
opportunity to closed won. Of course, that's like the way I would see like an ideal situation. And I feel like
Sure.
each of those touch points, marketing has an opportunity to play some kind of a role, and
Yeah.
depending on the size of the organization. But I think if marketing, really understands the prospects and the ICP on a deep level, you understand the pain points, you understand what people are trying to solve. Um, then perhaps you can develop, resources that can, like I talked to a fractional CMO a couple of weeks ago, and I said, well, what do you think about sales enablement? Because I'm a big believer in like, sales enablement, developing battle cards, developing messaging, things like that. And he said,
Sure.
actually, the way I would put it is like buyer enablement,
Yeah.
and kind of reframing it a little bit and just thinking about, ways for kind of taking sales and marketing, that verbiage out of it and just sort of focusing, it kind of puts the focus on the buyer a lot more. And then I
Hmm.
think there's opportunities, like where marketing can come in with I don't know, like a Loom video audit or just different pieces of collateral, certain value uh,
Yeah.
driven pieces of messaging or content that can kind of help support that buyer along those steps. I know I put a lot out there, but what do you think of that idea?
I'm a big fan of like, and it serves a selfish purpose, but like a buyer's guide being, a relevant content and digestible or consumable content on a website or, sent out via some sort of campaign. As one, it helps steer the company in the direction of being able to actually purchase something you're selling. But two, give sales somebody that they can connect with and reach out to. What's
Mhm.
interesting though is like it's almost like what we're needing to see and get better at is marketing going further down the pipeline or the funnel, more and sales coming up more, right? Versus
Mhm.
that intersection of where there is that handoff, call it as an MQL or a hand raiser where sales really had no influence in it. But then they take it over from that point, and then everybody just kind of like backs up, and it's a true handoff where what a lot of times what we were trying to do, and we had some success in this, is as like marketing is putting content out there as people are digesting things and maybe they're not scoring a threshold high enough that rates, a hand raiser or calling it a qualified lead, but giving sales access to those lower score threshold leads that are digesting some content and
Mhm.
continuing to be relevant and reaching out to them directly, maybe not with a hard ask, but that really helps, right? Like putting the
Yeah.
human side of that and putting a
Mhm.
person at that level. Similar where as you get kind of into the middle or the end of the funnel and you're the sole sales rep reaching out to the buyers and the evaluators at a company, having that marketing voice is helpful as well as like kind of like the air cover, just continuing
Mhm.
validation of like case study type things, ROI scenarios,
Mhm.
stuff that's going to help them, feel more confident about moving things forward.
When you hear that phrase buyer enablement, what do you think about it? Or if you prefer sales enablement, either way, what do you think about, when you hear a phrase like that?
When I heard buyer enablement, I immediately started thinking about like the buyer's guide that we were talking about, right? sales enablement to me, right, is by default always just viewed as like training,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
and usage of systems and bettering execution of skills and things like that. But the
Yeah.
buyer enablement, I mean, it's a concept of a word I hadn't really heard, I probably have, but not really
Yeah.
thought about until you brought that up.
Yeah. It's
But
an
again, I
interesting
think,
reframe, isn't it? Interesting reframe. But
yeah, and
maybe you need both buyer enabled and sales enablement because I think you do need something like sales enabled. The way I look at it, and you've worked in kind of enterprise, and I don't know if you were near enterprise or enterprise. You've worked at a lot of different kind of online recruitment
yeah.
websites that so you're kind of in a little bit of a different world than kind of smaller companies that are trying to figure this out. But at that level, you things like competitive intelligence or looking at win-loss scenarios
Mhm.
or getting good head-to-head positioning analysis versus competitors. I mean, that kind of stuff can really help the sales team, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of sellers would probably say the same thing, but we were in a pretty saturated market with tons of competition. Whether it be point solutions that could kind of nip at the heels of what you're trying to sell and take a little bit of the market share
Mhm.
away, or
Mhm.
larger platforms that could just gobble up in entirety, of somebody's budget and leave no room for you to have that. So it's pretty important, like, to get ahead of that quickly to learn like the
Mhm.
span of, all of the competition that's out there and the level at
Yeah.
which their engagement will be.
Mhm.
Because we knew, right, if you're going up against a larger platform like an HCM, coming from the applicant tracking world,
Mhm.
an HCM provider that has an ATS that's part of it, odds are, they're at a level, the HCM providers at a level of executive that they're speaking to that's way higher than we are at. So like
Mhm.
we're going to be butting our heads up against something that's probably an immovable
Mhm.
mountain that we
Mhm.
can't overcome versus a point solution we could figure out how to sell around better. But yeah, I think it's all
Mhm.
relevant and needed. I don't know if it pertains like how you've got yourself a hard job, right? I think everybody's
Mhm.
realizing that most buyers or those evaluating now are trying to do way more on their own
Yeah.
independent research before they talk to a person.
Mhm.
Um, and get themselves 80-90% of the way to a decision and even maybe
Mhm.
a product identified that they want to buy before they have to and maybe even reluctantly connect with somebody.
Mhm.
So figuring that balance out is tough, right? Because messaging, I think, is
Mhm.
key in how forceful you're trying to push a product awareness or a meeting getting booked or something along those
Mhm.
lines. But how do you balance and kind of like have that thread that needle, if you
Mhm.
will?
So give me your thoughts. I mean, I'd be happy to share my thoughts. Of course, this is
Yeah.
what we do every day, help companies with messaging. But give me your thoughts on, what do you think good messaging looks like? And what is it? What are the components of like good messaging? If you
Heck,
could
I
out
feel
of
like I
it.
don't even know anymore, right? I think that's
Okay.
the tough part, right? Because like the
Okay.
old school seller
Yeah.
in me was always like,
Yeah.
you use the most common used medium of like LinkedIn,
Yeah.
email, or phone. And back in my days of when I was selling things at like Career Builder,
Hmm.
it was pretty just direct. Hey, do you want to have this meeting? Let's get on a call and talk. And there wasn't that opportunity for them to be able to research so much more. So I think it's more
Hmm.
awareness campaigns,
Yeah.
education type messaging, softer asks around meetings,
Hmm.
opportunities to say, if you want to connect, let's do that. But I think this is
Yeah.
more of a world where you've got to give a lot more.
Yeah.
And everybody always says like,
Hmm.
bring value to me. Sure, like that's relevant, but it's hard to figure out what that value looks like. But it's more along
Hmm.
the lines of hey, we've built all of this content. We're just going to send this to you in an opportunity to see if this is going to
Yeah.
help, whatever you're up against, right? Like I say, you build something like a buyer's guide that they can use to internally navigate the complexities of purchasing software at their company.
Hmm.
That's a value add that you can send their way, right? And that's agnostic to
Hmm.
your product, but it gets your
Yeah.
brand and gets your awareness, on their radar.
Definitely. And I think the reason why to tie it back to what we started with in the conversation about getting the
Yeah.
business strategy nailed up front is to me that in our experience with the clients that we help, that actually makes the messaging a lot easier because especially if you have like sales and marketing on the same page with refining the ICP,
Yeah.
doing buyer personas, understanding those, doing the positioning, the differentiation. So once you kind of do those steps, setting company goals, even potentially doing OKRs. I don't know if you guys had
Mhm.
OKRs at where you were, but
Mhm.
getting all of that stuff clear, and then writing the messaging from there. And of course, you still need a framework to write the messaging, but when you understand the audience, the person you're writing it to, it makes it a lot easier than to kind of, what we see so often is to try to reverse engineer it by starting with at the messaging piece and trying to work backward and then trying to take some stuff and plug it into AI and hoping for the best and trying to figure
Yeah.
it out. To me, something like that is not going to get you the same results as sort of starting at the foundation. Like when you build a house, you got to put the foundation first before you can do the
Yeah.
walls and the roof. If you try to start with the roof, it's not going to work. So I don't know. That's
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I told you that I left Employ back in December, and I'm
yeah.
talking with a couple folks here about a interesting opportunity that I might jump at, and like they're startup, but they're incredibly thoughtful of how they're going to take this to market, and like
Mhm.
being narrowly focused on, a tight ICP.
Oh, good.
And I think that's key, right? For a lot, right? Unless you want to have
Mhm.
this wave of, pandemonium or hype that just grows your product and you're going to be something to everyone. If you could, get in really tight to an ICP then and master that and move on from there,
Mhm.
I think that's, key now, right? Because all of your
Mhm.
messaging is highly tuned to that,
Yep.
to the commonalities that they have. The personas are all relatively similar.
Mhm.
The list is endless as the value behind that.
Well, especially for like a startup, I mean, the growth trajectory is like an emotional roller coaster. We've all experienced that. Anybody who's
Yeah,
worked with a startup or in a startup, I've worked, I have a startup and I've worked with startups, and
sure.
it's wild. And so it feels like, as you kind of grow and as you start to figure it out, obviously you have to have a product and an offer nailed, but you're looking for not you're trying to kind of straighten out that line a little bit and get the growth to be a little bit more predictable, right? As opposed to having
Yeah,
like these wild swings, like one month you're
yeah,
you're up, one month you have nothing. And so, I feel like when you get the business strategy right, nailed, and then you get the messaging nailed, what I've seen is that you start seeing a little bit more. You get some systems in place. You start, and it's not just kind of like all based on what the founder does from
yeah.
6 a.m. to midnight or whatever his hours are. It's not based on his work schedule. You're kind of putting
Right.
systems in place. So then you're looking for more predictable growth, right? Isn't that the goal?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And it makes it, you brought up a good point, right? So like most organizations, I mean, there's more now that are like industry focused, have their divisions that are industry focused. But even where I was just at it with Employ, we had three flagship products. Literally every company in the world, we could sell something to someone.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the approach at one point, was like, how do we generalize messaging to get it in front of everybody to try to pull them in, and realizing quickly that, you have to take this down to the product level
Mhm.
and message with somebody, specifically that's going to fit better in this bucket. This persona here differently than you're going to message to somebody over here.
Mhm.
All while kind of finding that balance. Yeah, I think it's key. Otherwise, I mean, you probably see it all day. The generic messaging that's reaching inboxes and LinkedIn inboxes is just, skipped over entirely because there's
Mhm.
zero
Mhm.
thought behind it and zero personalization that matters.
Yep, 100%. And actually, I literally just wrote a blog actually about this. The ways. I mean, I've written a lot of blogs, but the posts about this. But the way messaging is generic and that makes you invisible. But
Yeah.
now I see even in cold email, I see quote unquote personalization where they will say quick note, Paul. So like
Yeah.
even though they use like a personalization token and my name is in
Yeah.
there, it's still completely generic. So
Totally.
I mean, the way we think about it is we kind of think about messaging as like three parts, right? We think number one, put the focus on the prospect, not you, not,
Mhm.
I don't use the word I, so put the focus on them.
Tough, right?
Number two, speak to a pain point. Don't
Hmm.
speak to your product. Don't pitch slap them. Don't say, what you're offering. Ask them a question about, even if you don't know exactly what their pain point is, take an educated guess or do some homework, do a little
Yeah,
homework on it, and
sure.
that starts to, speak to like, do you even have an ICP, or are you just doing like a spray and pray email campaign? That doesn't work. So yeah, so if you have an ICP, that's detailed, you're going to understand that the pain points that you've heard from actual customers or prospects that you've talked to that you've tried to make customers. You're gonna understand what their pain points likely are. So yeah, you can at least say give an educated guess, and then part three of that is offer. When I say offer something of value, offer, hey, would it help if I did like an audit of your website messaging, or
Yeah.
would it help if I came out and did a free estimate of your roof to see if you even need our help? Just something like
Yeah.
that. So to me, when you use that three-step, messaging approach, that works a lot better than saying, hey, just circling back, just checking in, quick question. None of
Yeah.
that stuff works. Anyway, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I like the audit angle is always key, right? I think that's a good way to get into a good conversation and possibly show people things that they're not necessarily thinking about today. I'm
Yeah.
curious from your experience right now,
Yeah.
given what you're focused on, is like what are you seeing as like common expectations or goals of like the balance of like a true inbound lead, that's coming in organically versus what, marketing or sales is generating through, targeted outbound efforts. Like is what's like common ratio goals that folks are having right now?
You mean when you say ratio, that you mean like what part of
Yeah.
your
They want
outreach should be inbound versus outbound, or
Yeah,
like?
exactly. Or what part of the leads, right? What part of what's actually coming in, and the success should be attributed to inbound versus outbound.
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think, getting into that classic discussion about attribution is always one of
Hmm.
those things that you hear a lot about. And I've actually never been like a huge fan of kind of getting into like, oh, is it last touch? Is it multi-touch? And, all
Sure.
of these attribution things. To me, I just think that's kind of a waste of time. And it just shows that sales and marketing don't have alignment. If everybody's saying, fight, like you said earlier, fighting over this is
Yeah.
our lead, or that's our
Who
lead.
care? Yeah.
Yeah, so that should be off the table. So I mean the whole, but I feel like, so I mean the way I actually think about it myself is like, inbound, outbound, and nearbound. So nearbound would be like the referral side of it. So
Hmm.
having those three pieces, and then so that's like your true, like what you would call like an all-bound campaign, as opposed to just focusing on one, or the one, number one, number two, or number three. So I think you kind of need like all three of those pieces, kind of set up and kind of running, and having
Hmm.
them all, and then the way I've been thinking about lately, just in terms of my own outreach, is, things are not, as kind of simple as they were, 5 or 10 years ago, where like you send an email to somebody as cold outreach, and then you try to call them, and then you try to email them again, and then you try to call them
Sure.
again. So now all of these things are kind of interwoven, where like you're doing the email campaign, you're doing the outreach, on LinkedIn DMs, you're doing YouTube videos, you're doing a podcast maybe. So separating, obviously you have to have clarity of like what's our outbound campaign. Okay, that's going to be our emailing, our calling, our DM messaging. What's our inbound campaign? It's going to be the content we produce, the social posts, the LinkedIn post, the podcasts we do, the YouTube video content we're creating. So that's our inbound, and then and then we have to think about our near bound, and our referral business and possible partners that could be bringing us business, and think about, how is that different? That's going to be very different, in terms of the messaging and the value add versus, like somebody who comes in either as an outbound or an inbound lead.
Mm.
An inbound lead, of course, is going to be a lot more like, people call it now like pre-sold. That's a very optimistic way to say it. But like when you
Sure.
create a lot of content, like you said earlier, they're
Yeah.
looking at all the content, they're doing all this research. So somebody who's going to be an inbound lead is going to be a lot more, familiar with you, whereas the outbound lead is going to be, you're going to have to do a little bit more work to kind of speak to their pain and give them something of value. And then the near bound, the referral lead, that's going to be a very different conversation, what they're looking for as far as a partner, partnering on that. But so when you get all those three kind of working together, to me, that's very complicated, but also,
Mhm.
when you kind of keep it straightforward and you get those pieces in place, to me, that's kind of the answer now. I mean, I know that's like a really complicated answer to your question. I don't
Yeah.
know if that answered it, but um, I think
I
you need
just
all three.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I just think, the quest of getting more of all three is always there. But obviously, a lot of companies until they figure it out are heavily reliant on just hand raisers, those pre-sold folks,
Yeah.
being the source of, majority of our pipeline and ultimate revenue that's coming through, while the other two remain relatively
Mhm.
untapped or at least not tapped to their full potential.
Yeah, and I don't know, you would probably, I'm sure you would have thoughts about, lead quality versus quantity. And
Mm,
that's where, like, I'm a big believer in quality over quantity, and
sure.
fewer touch points if you have to, but if it's the right people, because that's where you can really succeed when you do the business strategy and then get the messaging right. You're going to get better customers. You're going to get people
Mhm.
who are more relevant, who actually need what you're selling, you're offering. And I just feel like the it also helps you, just based on some companies I've worked with, it also helps you on retention and your churn rate, because when you're
Sure.
bringing people in the door who actually are more relevant and actually feel a real urgency to use your solution, product, or service to get a certain result, then they're probably going to be more committed to continuing with you, as opposed to, getting in the door and then leaving after a month or 3 months or 6 months trying to get out of the
Mhm.
contract. So I feel like, that's going to help you, with that as well. But do you have any thoughts on
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, thoughts are that I'm aligned with that, right? I think you nailed it there. Yeah, it's always again kind of this balance of, especially if you take an AE or an SDR, like, how heavy and how much expectation you have on self-generated pipeline. Again, I'm relatively aligned with you in the fact that
that?
ultimately I never cared where it came from in terms of like who to give like credit and
Mhm.
and where to say the success came from. It was all supposed to be a cohesive kind of machine moving, and
Mhm.
everybody had influence in different areas. But that said, right, I mean, it's obvious that there's a volume disparity and sometimes even a
Mhm.
quality disparity of like
Mhm.
what's coming from, again, those self-generated or inbound leads versus
Mhm.
I picked 5 accounts or 5 companies. I for months researched them and reached out to people, and now I've got 2 opportunities that came from that. Volume smaller, quality is likely a lot higher, and
Mhm.
even revenue potential could be potentially higher in some of those scenarios as
Mhm.
well. So yeah,
Boy, it helps when you really understand the customer, right? I mean, the more you
totally.
can understand the customer, the better you're going to be, right?
Well, and again, that's where the ICP comes from, because otherwise you just like you're gonna give an AE 700 accounts because they've got the Northeast territory and tell them to go
Mhm.
have fun. Like they always don't know where to start, right? You kind of
Yeah.
hone in from there and try to get to that, depending on what solution you're selling and the volume
Mhm.
of which and their sales cycle, right? What are the 10
Mhm.
that you need to go after and focus
Mhm.
primarily on that?
Are there what's your advice for SDRs or AEs working a territory? I mean, are there some ways that they can some things that they can do to improve their messaging? I noticed that I think at your last role you did sales training. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about ways that the sales reps can get better at messaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just total personalization, and it's like getting to a shorter list essentially.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
again, if I give you this territory, it's huge.
Mhm.
What do you do with that, right? You're not going to just start at go alphabetically or by employee size. Maybe that's your strategy. It's probably not the
Mhm.
best thoughtful one.
Mhm.
But it's, how do you identify with in the industries where are we strongest? Within that, right, who has the highest propensity to spend based upon, the makeup of their organization. And then it's researching, right?
Mhm.
we used to do a ton of front end auditing
Mhm.
around, what's their current applicant tracking system, what's their current candidate experience, go apply to one of
Mhm.
their jobs and see if it's, subpar, and
Mhm.
let's provide that feedback to the right people. And as you move
Mhm.
up the chain in your outreach, you get less of the focus around, the nuance of features and more focused around the impact of the business and
I like that.
the lack of change and the impact of either not or actually changing.
I like that. You guys are out there doing some kind of first person research, applying to
Trying.
their positions. That's the stuff you have to
Yeah.
be doing, right? So
Well, it's like,
how would you know what their process is unless you kind of try to go through it
yeah.
yourself? Yeah.
It's kind of a luxury, and I don't know if every industry has that, right? If you're selling CRMs, are you able to see who's got Salesforce versus Slack? I
Hmm.
mean, you could use those tools out there that try to guide you in that direction, but it was fairly easy when we were selling something that was, website facing and candidate
Hmm.
facing. You could just go and view it and see what's the current setup in the current tech stack,
Yeah.
audit it. You now have, the roadmap, and we've given you the intel to say if they have this solution, they likely have one of these three pain points. Surface
Hmm.
that and talk about what that impact would be.
Fantastic. Well, this is
Yeah.
really insightful,
Yeah.
John. Thank you so much
Enjoyed it.
for taking a couple of minutes to talk to
Sure.
talk to me, and it was a really great conversation.
Yeah, agreed, Paul. Thanks. Good luck with everything too, okay? Let's
Yeah.
stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.